And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather again showing some snow right along the southwest coast here with this low farther back to the west. Next storm coming up toward the Aleutians, bringing increasing wind, rain, and snow into that area, with snow persisting over the central part of the state. Then for tomorrow, this system pushes gale force winds and rain into the Alaska Peninsula, with increasing wind and precipitation for the Pribilof Islands as the low lifts just north of Atka Island in the afternoon. Panhandle, dry, sunshine, scattered snow showers in the interior. And then for Friday, that front swings in almost into the Barren Islands here, or into the Barren Islands by the afternoon hours. That'll bring wind and rain into south central Alaska, rain and snow here over the Kuskokwim Valley, with snow for the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, or actually snow showers for the Kuskokwim Delta, and a lot better conditions down here over the Aleutians. And for the coastal water forecast, northeast winds 10 to 15 knots on the central and south coast north at 10, and Lynn Canal north 15, central southern inner channels northwest at 10 to 15 knots. For Friday, north winds 10 to 15 knots for the inside waters, northwest 15 to 20 knots on the south coast, 15 knots on the central coast, variable 10 to 15 on the north coast. Prince William Sound, North Gulf Coast tomorrow, as well as Cook Inlet, all looking at light variable winds at 10 knots with seas anywhere from 2 to 3 feet. West winds at 20 knots, Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. Looking ahead to Friday, northeast winds 15 to 25 knots here for Cook Inlet, strongest south of the Forelands. Gale force southeast winds 40 knots, Kamishak Bay, 35-knot gales for the Barren Islands, and east-southeast 30 knots for the North Gulf Coast, and east at 25 for Prince William Sound with seas at about 5 feet. Kodiak Island, variable winds 10 to 15 knots for the day Thursday. Alaska Peninsula, small craft advisories, southeast winds 25 to 30 knots, and east winds at 20 knots for Bristol Bay. And then the outlook for Friday, Kodiak Islands, small craft advisory, south winds now 25 to 30 knots, south at 30 knots for Bristol Bay, and southwest winds for the Alaska Peninsula 30 to 35 knots. And for the western Aleutians tonight, Adak westward, north to northeast winds 30 to 40 knots with seas 11 to 18 feet. And for Adak and Atka, east winds 30 knots, and for the eastern Aleutians, east to south winds 25 to 30 knots. And then for Friday, eastern Aleutians, west-northwest winds 30 knots, northwest 25, Adak and Atka, and the western Aleutians, north winds at 20 knots. And the southwest coast for tomorrow, brisk wind advisory, southeast winds 25 knots, brisk wind advisories for St. Lawrence Island, southeast at 25, Norton Sound, east at 20, southeast 20 for St. Matthew Island, and the Pribilof, southeast winds 25 knots with 7-foot seas. And for Friday, Pribilof Islands west at 30 knots, north 30 knots, St. Matthew Island, northeast winds 30 knots for Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta Coast, turning southeast at 30 for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast. Eastern Boulevard Sea Coast, still looking at some gale force easterlies here from Kaktovik demarcation point. Otherwise, 10 to 20 knots out of the east for the remainder of the central and eastern coast. And then western Arctic coast, light west winds at 10, variable winds 10 to 15 knots for the Chukchi Sea. And then for Friday, Chukchi Sea, north winds 10 to 25 knots, northeast at 10 knots for the central and western Arctic coast. Eastern Boulevard Sea coast looking at east winds at 10 knots.